Some medieval books were feared not because of what they said, but because people believed they could kill. One such book was chained shut, and it still is. History got weird. The like button still weirder. Tap it. Chapter 1. Octopus oracles were a real thing. The tide pool shimmered beneath the morning light like a polished mirror, disturbed only by the slow, pulsing movement of an octopus unfurling from this rocky crevice. Its skin shifted colors, mottled brown, then gray, then pale ochre, as it glided along the pool's edge, a silent specter brushing the sea-worn stones with a ledge, carved by time and wind. An old man in a salt-stained robe leaned forward, watching. This was not mere curiosity, it was divination. Long before telescopes and test tubes, before scriptures were printed or dissected, the ancient Greeks looked to the world itself for signs: birds in flight, the crackle of fire, the rustling of leaves, and in some forgotten corners of the Ion coast they looked too. The octopus, the practice, never gained the grandeur of Delhi, where the Pythia inhaled vapors and spoke in riddles, nor did it echo with the sacred oak whispers of Dana. It lived in quieter places, rocky shorelines, small island communities, coasts, reachable only by boat or goat path. There in these linear spaces, where land meets sea, the octopus oracles practiced their craft. They were not always called that. The name comes later, Latinized, romanticized, reinterpreted by scholars, squinting at crumbling fragments. But in their time, they were known simply as watchers, sometimes priestesses, sometimes fishermen, earned seers, always individuals with a certain reputation they did not claim to control, the gods they claimed only to listen. The octopus, polypus, in their tongue, was a creature of many meanings to the Greeks. It was clever and strange, a shape shifter that could vanish in a puff of ink, or fold itself into a shell no wider than a clenched fist. Homer had no trouble likening Odysseus's bloodied hands to the tentacles of one dragged from its lair. It was a symbol of struggle, cunning, persistence. It was sea-born, slippery, sacred too. Deities like Proteus, and possibly Poseidon himself. The sea, after all, was not merely geography. It was personality. It had moods, secrets, appetites. The oracle setting was humble, no marble columns, just a tide pool. Sometimes several scouted out and mapped with obsessive care. Pools too deep or too wide were useless. The best were shallow basins tucked into the arms of rugged stone pools that trapped seawater. Long after the tide receded in them, the octopus could be observed, without interference, not caught, never caught. To trap the creature was to sever the channel. They came on their own, and if they didn't come, that too was a sin. The watcher would begin before sunrise, when the winds were still and the sea quiet. They would cleanse themselves in sea ether, wrap themselves in linen soaked with brine and ash, and approach the tide pool as one might approach an altar. Ritual words were spoken, sometimes sung, not to summon, but to prepare, to clear the mind and let perception sharpen. What followed was part observation, part intuition. The movements of the octopus were studied with intensity. Was it sluggish or swift? Did it coil tightly or sprawl out? Did it change color in a flicker or stay pale and trembling? Did it lift itself from the floor of the pool or hug the rocks, as if hiding from something unseen? Every motion could mean something. War, peace, betrayal, fertility, storms, disease. And then there was the matter of ink. If the octopus inked the water, it was not always taken as fear. Sometimes it was a sign of divine protest or mourning. In one account, a village woman from the island of Australia sought the oracle's guidance after her son vanished. At sea, the watcher fasted for a day and sat by the pool until a large octopus emerged near dusk. It moved only briefly before expelling a dense cloud of ink, spread across the pool like a shroud. The watcher wept, declaring the boy lost, his fate swallowed by the sea. Days later, the body washed ashore was a coincidence most likely, but the story passed from mouth to mouth, memory to memory. The octopus oracle was never questioned again. No scrolls survive that codified this form of divination. It was not systematized. It resisted structure. That was part of its appeal and its danger. Unlike the more established oracles, whose temples generated wealth and power, the tide pool watchers remained peripheral, respected, locally feared, occasionally, but never institutionalized, and perhaps that's why they vanished. With so little trace, still echoes remain. A fragment of a 3rd century BCE poem speaks of the priestess of the arms, who reads the writhing limbs of sea things by the moon's silver eye. A temple relief from Nekos shows a woman seated beside what appears to be a rocky pool with an octopus carved in careful detail at her feet, its tentacles entwined with seaweed and stone. The symbolism is unmistakable to anyone who knows what to look for. Unlike birds or entrails, the octopus could not be easily interpreted by amateurs. It did not offer the simplicity of a straight flight or a healthy liver. Its meanings shifted. One oracle's omen might be another's contradiction. This made it risky, but also potent. It required trust, not just in the gods, but in the interpreter, and that trust, once given, could change the course of lives. Athenian records mention a dispute between 2 shipping merchants over a disputed route to Phoenicia. One claimed that a dream had foretold danger. The other insisted he had consulted a watcher on the coast of Euba who had seen an octopus split its limbs and rise from the water, a sign, he claimed, of success in crossing turbulent paths. The merchant who followed the oracle's advice reached Ty with full cargo and returned twice before his rival made the journey. But it was not always so clean. There are tales, mostly whispered by later writers, of watchers who claimed too much. One, a man named Callan of Thera, boasted that his octopuses could predict not just fate, but the will of specific gods. He began charging wealthy patrons for private readings, offering tailored omens. When a storm destroyed half the island's docks, and 2 children drowned in a tide pool near his sanctum, the people blamed him not for the storm, but for misusing the gift. He vanished shortly after, and his name became a cautionary one to those who revered the practice. The octopus was not a tool. It was a mirror, a fragment of the divine mind shaped in suckers and sinew. Its shifting colors were moods of the sea god, its movements the logic of the abyss brought to the surface. It knew things not because it was wise, but because it was wild, and in that wildness closer to the gods than any priest. This attitude fits the broader pattern of Greek divination, a deep respect for nature's patterns and a readiness to listen to what lay outside human control. The oak leaves at Donna, the flights of cranes at Nemea, the silence before the earthquake. The Greeks were not inventing meaning, they were tuning into what they believed was already being spoken in languages older than words. The octopus oracles represented one of the more enigmatic dialects. In that cosmic conversation they occupied the edge, geographically, socially, theologically, but their presence tells us something profound, that in a world obsessed with reason and rhetoric, there was still room for the irrational, for the fluid, for voices that came bubbling from a tide pool, dragging bits of seaweed and myth behind them. What they heard in those quiet moments beside the sea remains unknowable. There are no transcripts, only stories, a crumbling shell found beside a carved stone, a half-remembered chant passed down by Sponge. Cavers, a fisherman's tale that his grandfather once watched a woman speak to an octopus, and that the octopus turned red before vanishing, and that night lightning struck the mountaintop. The sea remembers, even if we do not, and still today, if you walk along the coasts of certain islands in the early morning when the tide is low and the world is quiet, you might find a pool untouched by wind. You might see, if you're patient, an octopus slide out from under a rock, stretch its arms like a yawn, and move as if it knows you're watching, as if it's saying something you've forgotten how to understand. You won't hear it in words, but maybe if you listen like the ancients did, you'll understand it anyway. Chapter 2. Romans used fermented fish guts as a condiment. The smell would reach you before the gates, salty, sharp, unmistakable. It hung in the air like heat off stone drifting over hills and villas, warning the senses before a single jar came into view. Not unpleasant, not entirely, just powerful, alive. Atia. That was the first sign you were nearing a garum factory on the outskirts of Pompeii. Before the city was buried in ash, you could walk down a path toward the sea and find rows of open vats, some round, some rectangular, set into the earth like shallow tombs. They were not hidden. There was no shame in the work. These vats, filled with chopped anchovies, mackerel heads, tuna, offcuts, and the soft entrails of fish, long since stripped of their meat, were vessels of transformation. Salted, stirred, and left under the southern sun, they produced a golden liquid prized across the Roman world. Garum. A fermented fish sauce, yes, but more than that, it was flavor, wealth, preservation status. It was a marker of Roman identity as much as sandals or aqueducts. And for the people who lived in its time, it wasn't strange. It was essential. The recipe, if you could call it that, was brutally simple. Fish guts, scraps, what the fishermen didn't sell or eat, were piled into vats and thickly layered with coarse salt. Nothing else. No vinegar, no herbs, no magic. The salt did its work, drawing moisture from the flesh, inhibiting the wrong kind of rot. Then came the sun, and with it, time. Weeks passed, sometimes months. Slowly the mixture liquefied. Enzymes broke down proteins into amino acids. The salt cured and clarified. What rose to the top was a translucent amber liquid, rich in umami, intense in aroma, and utterly Roman. The thick sludge left at the bottom, called alec, was not wasted. It went to the poor, the army, the slaves. It was less refined, more pungent, but still nourishing for the wealthy. It was the garum itself they wanted, strained, bottled, sealed in clay, far stamped with the mark of its origin. These jars traveled by ship from Baetica, along the coast of Hispania, through the ports of Gaul and Italy, up the rivers into the heart of the empire. Baetica, now southern Spain, was garum country. Their production scaled to an industry great. Factories stood near the sea, with long troughs, stonework tables, and dedicated crews who knew the timing of tides and fermentation with the same instinct that vintners knew grapes. They didn't just make sauce, they made brands. One of the most famous producers was the company of Oaz Umbidius Scourus, a name still legible on aeri uncovered in Pompeii. His garum was labeled Floss, Floris, the flower of the finest of the fine. He sold more than source, he sold reputation in Pompeii. You can still see the mosaic in the entryway of his house. Tall amphora proudly displayed with his name beside it. The message was clear. This man got rich selling fish guts, and you would do well to remember it. The uses of garum were nearly endless. It was poured over vegetables, stirred into stews, drizzled on fruits, mixed with oil, vinegar, honey. It seasoned meats, and pickles, was used in marinades, and formed the base of countless sources in the kitchens of villas and taverns. Cooks would keep it close at hand, much like oil or wine. Ours, the Roman cookbook compiled centuries later, includes garum in nearly every recipe, from boiled leeks to roasted dormice. Imagine a Roman cook at work, his sleeves rolled back, hands stained from herbs and fish, the heat of the hearth filling the kitchen. He stirs a pot of lentils and adds a measure of garum, not from a ladle, but from a small clay jug, its narrow neck designed to control the pour. He doesn't taste yet, he knows the balance by feel, the sharp tang. 'Twill soften as it simmers, melding into something savory and round. Garum wasn't a garnish. 'Twas alchemy. Its importance stretched far beyond taste. It preserved in a world before refrigeration, salt, and fermentation were survival. Garum added not just flavor but longevity. A salted, fermented fish sauce could last months, years, even without spoiling, as long as the jar stayed sealed. Amphorae discovered in sunken Roman ships are sometimes intact. Their Contents still viscous after 2,000 years. Archaeologists at Pompeii and Herculaneum found whole garum workshops preserved by Vuvius. Bats still have full tools scattered as if dropped mid-task. Inscriptions on the amphor detail their contents and quality. Garum soriorum licumen optimum. Maria XPC Combro. Each term had meaning. Garum was the finest extract. Licumen, a term that over time sometimes replaced garum, could mean the same or something slightly coarser. Muria was a strong. Rionalic was the dregs. The distinctions mattered. Patrons paid for them. Factories labeled their wares not just with names, but with regional origin. Much like olive oil or wine, the reputation of a price. Baetica, Lusitania, Sicily, all had their own styles, their own grades. The finest sauces might be reserved for emperors and senatorial banquets. The coarser ones filled military rations, or stalls. One soldier's letter preserved on wax tablet mentions the delivery of liquid to his outpost on the Rhine. Even at the frontier garum traveled. Trade routes sprawled like veins from the heart of the empire, and garum flowed. Along them the jars, tall, thin-necked, sealed with resin or cork, were designed for stacking in ships. Thousands of amphi have been found in underwater wrecks, barnacled and silt-covered, bearing the inked names of their makers. Even in Roman Britain, far from the sun-soaked shores of the Mediterranean, fragments of garum jars have turned up, hinting at dinners once brightened by a splash of salted fish. Its appeal cut across class. The wealthy had the best, yes, but even those who lived in cramped and Sully, the city's apartment blocks, might afford it cheaper. Blend in Rome, a tenement cook might combine old lentils with garlic, chopped onions, and a spoonful of alessane quickly with barley bread, before returning to work. No extravagance, but it filled the stomach and pleased the tongue and the taste. Modern reconstructions describe it as deeply savory, rich in glutamates, more nuanced than its smell suggests. It was not meant to be consumed alone, but as a component. Sharp balancing, intensifying, much like salt or lemon, it lifted other flavors. Roman palates valued intensity. They liked bold wines, aged cheeses, sweet and sour combinations, strong contrasts. Garum fit perfectly, but its significance wasn't only culinary. The source was economic engine, social marker, and even cultural symbol. It required knowledge of fish, salt, sun, and timing. Its production created work, drove trade, and formed part of Rome's broader mastery of preservation and resource use. Nothing was wasted. Offal became gold wrought, became profit, and graffiti scrolled on the walls of Pompeii's workshops. Workers left there marks, names, jokes, symbols. One tile near a garum vat reads, Felix, Muria, happy brine. Another shows a crude drawing of a fish with rays drawn around it, like a saint or a sun. It might be a joke, or maybe reverence. After all, this humble creature, gutted and salted, built fortunes. There is a story, told, not written but remembered, of a merchant in Bo Claudia, a coastal town in Hispania, where the ruins of fish sauce factories still bake under the Andalusian sun. He arrives before dawn. The air is thick, the vats are steaming slightly. He inspects the liquid, nods to his workers, checks the jars for cracks. He carries with him a small taste sample in a shell cup. At the dock, he meets a trader from Emcelia, who opens his own vial. They trade sips like vintners, judge each other's quality, haggle over price. Gold is exchanged, and for I loaded the source will reach the markets of Lugdunum. Even the kitchens of Londinium will flavor a roast boar on the Thames. And garum was empire in a bottle. 'Tis easy to forget that something so unglamorous, fish guts, salt, heat, once occupied so central a place in one of history's greatest civilizations. But the Romans didn't forget. They celebrated it. They improved it. They traded it with pride. What they tasted in garum was more than seasoning. They tasted reach, technique, the power to bend spoilage into substance. They made the sea shelf stable, and perhaps that is the real genius of garum, that it turned decay into delight, that it took what was cast off, what smelled of endings, and transformed it into something sought after, and savored a source born from rot revered by emperors in the ruins of Pompeii among the fresco of feasts, and God's once small amphora sits preserved in volcanic ash-faded letters still cling to its side, proclaiming its excellence optimum, scoring a remnant of flavor empire, and the enduring Roman appetite for transformation, for commerce, and for the bold. Chapter 3. Medieval people feared book curses in the stillness of a stone scriptorum where the only sounds were the scratching of quills and the distant toll of bells. A monk bent low over a manuscript. Candlelight flickered across the vellum, illuminating careful strokes of black ink. His hands were steady. He had spent months copying this text, page by page, line by line. Now at the bottom of the opening folio, he paused. He dipped his pen once more and wrote the final words of the work. Then, with a slower hand, he began a different kind of writing. A warning, a curse. Should anyone take this book, let him die the death. Let him be fried in a pan. Let the falling sickness and fever seize him. Let him be broken on the wheel and hanged. He did not write it in justice. Books in the medieval world were not possessions in the casual sense. They were objects of labor, sanctity, and considerable expense. A single manuscript might take a year or more to produce. The pages were made of animal skin, usually calf or sheep, scraped and prepared by hand. Ink was ground from oak galls or soot, pens carved from goose quills. Every letter was set down by a scribe, trained to maintain consistency across columns, margins, and illuminations. For religious houses, books were not only sources of knowledge, but vessels of sacred truth. They were rare, powerful, and constantly at risk. To lose a book was no small thing. Monasteries and cathedral schools kept their collections guarded. Books were chained to desks, locked in auraria, envenomed with care. But chains could be broken. Locks picked. Travelers passed through with unknown intentions. Students borrowed volumes and failed to return them. Even within the cloister, temptation lingered. In response, scribes turned to a form of protection that required no key: the book curse. These curses, scrolled at the beginning or end of a manuscript, were direct, unsparing, and deeply believed. They were threats, not of earthly law, but of divine retribution, spiritual booby traps for the soul. A thief might evade detection by men, but he could not escape the wrath of God. One such curse reads, "Whoever steals this book, may he be struck with Polly and all his members, and may he be rooted to the earth like a tree." Another invokes a more visceral fate: "May the hand that steals this book wither, and may it drop from the arm of its owner as he walks." There is a grim creativity to these lines. Some promise damnation: "May the soul of the thief be cut off from the body and cast into hell, where he shall suffer for all eternity with the devil and his angels." Others leaned into physical torment: "He who steals this book shall be boiled in lead, and his name shall be erased from the book of life." The threats were sometimes crude, sometimes poetic, but always personal. This was not abstract justice. It was tailored punishment, often vividly imagined. And that was the point: to make the consequences impossible to ignore. The curses were not hidden in fine print. They were written boldly, sometimes in red ink, or framed in ornamented borders. A few were accompanied by grotesque illustrations: a sinner dangling over flames, a skeletal figuring its own hand. Some curses were signed with a symbol or initials, implying that the scribe was invoking these penalties, not in general terms but as personal imprecation. This reflected a larger belief in the power of the written word. Medieval Christians viewed language, especially sacred or solemn language, as performative. To write something was to set it into the world with consequence. A curse penned by a monk, consecrated through fasting, prayer, or mere seriousness of purpose, could hold weight in heaven. The fear wasn't metaphorical, it was real. Even among those who might not have been fully literate, the presence of a curse carried power. The sight of red ink, the unusual form of a text, beginning with threats rather than prayers, sent a message: this object is protected. You have been warned. And the warning wasn't just for the original thief. Many of these books passed from hand to hand, bequeathed, traded, plundered in times of war. Curses, once written, often state scribes copying manuscripts would reproduce them either out of fear or respect. In time, the curse itself became part of the book's lineage, and one surviving manuscript from a monastic library in 13th century France, a copied curse reads, "This book belongs to St. Mary's. He who steals it shall be consumed by the fires of hell. He who buys it knowing its stolen shares, it's the same fate." The warning expanded its scope, not just the thief, but the buyer, the intermediary, the knowing accomplice. Guilt, by association, was eternal. There is no evidence that such curses were enforced by earthly courts. Their power lay in belief, not legality, but belief was strong for a monk who spent his life copying psalms or commentaries, whose every day was measured by bells and prayer. The idea of divine punishment was not abstract philosophy, it was ever-present. Sin had consequences. Theft of sacred knowledge was theft from God. That fear extended beyond monasteries and universities, where scholars often borrowed texts from shared libraries. It was understood that certain books came marked with divine warnings. An Oxford volume of canon law once bore the line, "Whoever steals this book, may his eyes be plucked out by ravens, and his body devoured by worms." Even early printed books, when the printing press began to change the nature of books themselves, sometimes retained the practice. The transition from manuscript to print didn't erase the sense of value in a 16th century Bible now housed in a German library. The frontispiece reads, "Whosoever removes this holy scripture from this house, may he die of hunger, and may his children beg for bread from strangers." These were not idle flourishes. They came from a culture where books were rare and theft threatened the entire community. When a book was stolen, it wasn't just a loss of property, it was a blow to the collective memory, to teaching, to worship. Many monastic libraries had only a few dozen volumes. One missing codex could leave a hole in theology, law, or medicine that no one nearby could fill. In one tale from an Irish abbey, a copy of the Gospel of John went missing. It was not bound in jewels or gold, but it was the only copy in the region for weeks. The abbot refused to begin morning readings, insisting the text was sacred and must be recovered. When it was finally returned quietly by an unknown hand, it bore a new inscription on the final page. "He who stole me is known to God. May he remember mercy." The curses served another function too. They signaled authorship and ownership. In an age before catalog systems, they reminded the reader that this book had been made by hands, sometimes at great cost. A scribe might spend his life copying no more than a few books. To lose one was to lose a portion of himself. In this way, the curses were more than threats. They were confessions of devotion. A monk cursing a thief was not merely angry. Was protecting something he believed had been trusted to him by his abbot, his order, or by God. And sometimes buried in the threats, there is a flicker of weary humor. One manuscript ends its curse with "Amen. But if you return the book quickly, perhaps we can forget all this." Another, "Whoever takes this book, let him be cast into the outer darkness, unless, of course, he brings it back before." Under these small concessions don't undercut the seriousness. They remind us that medieval people were not blind zealots, but fully human. They knew the line between fear and forgiveness. The curses were a tool, a last defense sharpened with ink and faith. Today, books are so abundant. They overflow from shelves, paperbacks pile up in charity shops. Digital files vanish into clouds. To fear for the life of a book now seems quaint, but in those earlier centuries, a book was a world entire, and its protection was a sacred duty. The curses remain not as echoes of superstition, but as evidence of how deeply words once mattered in faded script between prayers and psalms. They sit like quiet sentinels, reminders that even the most precious knowledge needs guardians, and sometimes those guardians wrote in Threats chapter 4. Pope Gregory IX declared war on cats in the year 1233. Pope Gregory IX issued a papal bull that would outlive its author, not in doctrinal influence, but in the curious echo of its consequences. The document known as Vox in Rama was not about cats, not directly. It was about heresy, about demons, secret rituals, and the unseen enemies of the Church. But, within its lines, nestled among the denunciations and lurid descriptions, was an image that would stain the reputation of an animal for centuries. It spoke of a black cat not as a creature of God's creation, but as an agent of the devil. Gregory the Ninth had risen to the papacy during a time of intense suspicion. The early 13th century was shaped by crusades, not only abroad, but at home. The Albigensian Crusade had been launched just a few decades prior, against the Cathars of southern France, a Christian sect deemed heretical by Rome. The Church, reeling from what it saw as internal corruption and spiritual threats, responded with force, and from that fervor came the formalization, a new weapon, the Inquisition. Gregory was not the originator of the Inquisition, but under his papacy, it found structure. He authorized inquisitors, particularly from the Dominican order, to root out heresy wherever it might hide in this atmosphere. Heresy was not just doctrinal error, it was betrayal. It was wrought in the body of Christendom, and it had to be exposed, condemned, and burned out. It was in this context that Vox in Rama was composed. The bull was a response to reports from Germany brought by a Dominican inquisitor named Conrad von Marburg. He claimed to have uncovered a secret satanic sect performing grotesque rituals. According to his account, initiates were required to deny Christ, kiss a toad, and worship a statue that spoke with the voice of the devil, and in the darkness of the ceremony, there appeared a black cat, the cat Conrad. It would walk backwards into the gathering, lift its tail, and allow the initiates to kiss its hindquarters. This was not symbolism. This was presented as evidence of a living demonic cult. Pope Gregory, convinced of the urgency and truth of the matter, published the bull as a warning. In the bull, the black cat was more than incidental. It was a sign, a creature through which Squeaton made his will known. The image fused quickly into the imagination of the time. Cats, particularly those of dark coloring, had long existed on the margins of folklore. Independent, nocturnal, and largely misunderstood, they had already attracted suspicion in a culture that valued obedience and hierarchy. Now they were named. The cat became a symbol of inversion, of that which did not bow to order, that which crept rather than stood upright, that which did not serve but observed. In a world shaped by Christian cosmology, where animals were expected to reflect the divine order, the cat's indifference became unsettling. What followed was not immediate doctrine, nor formal instruction to destroy cats, but the whisper had begun. The papal bull, spread by word and parchment, gave permission first to believe, then to act. In some towns, cats were called as part of purging heresy, not en masse, not always publicly, but systematically enough that accounts survive. In monasteries, black cats began to disappear. In villages, rumors circulated of witches keeping feline familiars, what had once been tolerated. As mouses became suspicious, an old woman feeding a stray might now be watched more closely. A house where cats gathered might be whispered about. At dusk, inquisitors did not need to decree cat hunts. They had already sown the soil. With fear, and fear, once rooted, grows in every direction. In some regions, killing a cat became an act of piety. Children were taught to stone them. Cats were tied in sacks and thrown into rivers. Festivals in parts of medieval France included ritual cat burnings, bonfires in the square with live animals tossed into the flames. These were not crimes, but community acts, spectacles of cleansing. The line between superstition and sanctioned belief had blurred to the Church. The bull had served its purpose. It warned of heretics. It reinforced the authority of inquisitors. It positioned Rome as vigilant against the darkness. But outside the Vatican walls, the image of the cat persisted, evolving beyond the text itself. The association between cats and demonic forces deepened over the following century. As belief in witches gained traction, so too did the idea that cats served them tea. They were said to carry messages to the devil, to guard charms, to drink spilled blood. Black cats especially were feared as shape-shifted spirits. Killing them was not cruelty, it was preemption. And yet cats had once held favor in Christian Europe. Earlier centuries saw them kept in monasteries and farms, valued for their role in controlling vermin. Some saints were even depicted with cats at their feet. But memories fade quickly when fear intervenes. By the time the plague reached Europe in the mid-4th century, the cat population in many cities and towns had been sharply reduced. This is where some historians draw a line, tentative, debated, but compelling. The bubonic plague, spread by fleas that lived on rats, thrived in urban conditions of poor sanitation and dense populations with fewer cats to control the rodents. The rats multiplied, the fleas moved more easily from animal to human. The Black Death swept through Europe in waves, killing millions. It is, of course, an oversimplification to lay the plague at the feet of cat killers. Trade, climate, migration all played their parts. The medieval world lacked the knowledge to trace disease vectors or understand infection, but the theory remains that one of the most feared creatures of the plague era might have been in some small way a victim of earlier fear. There are no documents tying Vox and Rama directly to plague deaths. The timeline stretches across a century, but history does not always move in direct lines. Sometimes it leaves echoes. A papal document naming cats as demonic participants in heresy may have contributed to a cultural suspicion that lingered long after the text was forgotten. In a small village in Saxony, a priest might have read the bull aloud from the pulpit, his voice steady as he named the signs of the devil's presence. A farmer might have remembered it a year later when his child fell ill and the neighbor's cat lingered too near. A magistrate might have heard of him as woman who spoke to animals and found in the memory of Vox in Rama a justification to arrest. Her belief is not static, it moves with the people who carry it, and once the cat had been marked, the stain was hard to remove. Pope Gregory IX did not write his bull with plague in mind. He did not intend a campaign against animals. His world was one of theological battlefields, of invisible enemies and spiritual rot. But his words, etched in ink and backed by Rome, had weight, and the cat's silent, solitary watching from rooftops and shadows became an unlikely casualty of that war. Chapter 5. Victorians made jewelry from human hair. The mourning customs of Victorian England were elaborate, deeply felt, and carefully observed. Death was not treated as a moment, but as a season, a long structured passage marked by black crape-drawn shutters, lowered voices, and an intricate language of grief. In this world of mourning where silence and symbols spoke louder than words, few tokens were as intimate or as enduring as hairwork, jewelry made from the hair of the dead. To modernize it might seem strange, but to the Victorians human hair was more than a remnant. It was a trace of the person themselves, unspoiled by death. Hair does not decay quickly. It holds its color, its texture. It can be brushed, plaited, shaped, and sealed. It can be worn close to the skin, woven into patterns. It's curled behind glass. In an age before photographs were common, before voices could be recorded, a lock of hair was something that could be touched, proof that the person had lived, and that some part of them remained. Victorian hair jewelry was not crude. It was finely crafted, often astonishingly so. Bracelets made from tightly woven hair, as intricate as lace. A bruise, shaped like wreaths, or anchors with hair twisted into spirals, and flowers, lockets, containing a single curl or braid, often set against silk or ivory, framed in gold or jet. Some were purely decorative, others bore inscriptions, names, dates, brief phrases, and enamel or engraving in memory of gone but not forgotten. Forever thine, there were rings set with hair in elaborate knots beneath crystal, or worn as hollow bands with a braid. Hidden side pendants, shaped like crosses or hearts filled with coils of hair pressed under domed glass. Some pieces incorporated pearls, or garnet symbolic stones associated with grief or blood. Others were plain and stark. Every detail had meaning. The making of these items was both an art and a ritual. Hair was collected carefully, cleaned in soap and water, and dried on white cloth to preserve its texture and sheen. For more complex pieces, especially those woven into open work patterns, the hair was treated with a light starch and wrapped around wire, or passed through special tables equipped with tiny holes. Skilled artisans, sometimes trained jewelers, sometimes women working from home, braided, knotted, or looped the hair using patterns recorded in instructional manuals. There were over 30 known techniques, including tablework, palette work, and gimping. Tablework, the most complex, required a specific frame. A round table with a hole in the center through which strands of hair were passed and weighted to maintain tension. The weaver would sit for hours, manipulating the strands with bobbins, forming chains that could be shaped into bracelets or garlands. The work demanded patience, precision, and strong light. Mistakes were difficult to undo. Not all pieces were made by professionals. Many were made at home, particularly those meant for private remembrance rather than public display. A mother might take a lock of her child's hair and braid it into a keepsake. A sister might sew a few strands into the lining of a locket. There are accounts of women learning the skill not just as craft, but as preparation for the moment when it would be needed. Hair work had existed before the Victorian era, but it flourished during it. The turning point came in 1861 with the death of Prince Albert. Queen Victoria, devastated by the loss of her husband, entered a mourning period that would last for the rest of her life. She wore black until her own death. 4 decades later, and with her court set the standard for mourning in the empire, her sorrow was not only personal, it became cultural. Mourning dress became codified. There were rules: how long one must wear black, when gray or lavender might be introduced, when jewelry might be worn again, and of what kind. Hair jewelry fit perfectly into this etiquette. It was somber but sentimental, visible. Victoria herself wore jewelry containing Albert's hair, and often gave similar pieces as gifts. Her influence spread through the aristocracy and into the middle class, and with it, the fashion for memorial hair work took root by the 1870s. Catalogs advertised hair jewelry openly. Some jewelers specialized in it. Some families kept albums filled with hair samples cataloged by name and date. In one surviving letter from 1874, a widow in Yorkshire writes to a jeweler in London, enclosing a small envelope: "Sir, within you will find the hair of my late husband William. I ask you to make of it a brooches and a bracelet in the style of your enclosed illustration. The clasp may bear his initials, W.J., in gold. I desire it to be simple and strong. I wear it daily." The pieces were not always hidden beneath layers of clothing. Many Victorians wore mourning jewelry openly. It was not macabre. It was appropriate to wear. A ring of hair was to show allegiance to memory, to the bonds of family and love that did not end with death. Some wore pieces for months, others for years. Some never removed them, and not all hair jewelry was about death. There existed a parallel tradition of romantic hairwork, tokens exchanged between lovers or given to mark engagements, marriages, even friendships. A soldier might leave a lock of his hair with his before going to war. Young woman might give a braided ring to her betrothed. These too were made with care, but often in lighter tones, more delicate settings, and cheerful symbolism. Clasped hands, birds, forget-me-nots. The line between mourning and affection was sometimes hard to draw. Love and loss were intertwined. A ring might begin as a token of courtship, and later be remade as a memorial. The same hair worn in joy might be worn in sorrow. Entire walls were sometimes adorned with woven hair. These were not everyday displays but commemorative pieces, wreaths of human hair shaped into flowers and vines framed behind glass. One family piece preserved in an American museum contains the hair of 12 siblings, each named in tiny script around a central rosette. The colors vary: blonde, chestnut, silvered brown, recording not just individuals but time itself. The practice extended across Britain, Europe, and into North America. Hairwork societies were formed. Magazines published patterns. It was a domestic art as much as a mourning one, a way to bind family and memory into something tangible, something that would not fade by the turn of the 20th century. The practice had begun to warn cultural attitudes toward death, shifted. Mourning became less public, less prolonged. Medicine advanced, and death moved from the home to the hospital. Photography had become widespread. People could preserve likeness in a printed image, not just in strands of hair, and fashions changed. The somber restraint of Victorian mourning gave way to the modern age's preference for brevity, brightness, and new beginnings. Still, the pieces remain. Museums hold collections of mourning jewelry, carefully labeled and preserved. Private families keep brews and rings in velvet-lined boxes. Some show the maker's name stamped inside the clasp. Others are anonymous, their stories lost their meaning, visible only in the craftsmanship. The tiny braids, the careful knots, the gold engraving that still reads, Mother, 1879. To the Victorians, hair jewelry was not odd. It was sacred, a way to hold on, to make memory tactile in a world where death was always near. They made art from the remains, not to deny the loss, but to honor the love that endured through it. Chapter 6. Abraham Lincoln is in a ghost photo. In the photograph, Mary Todd Lincoln sits still and solemn, dressed in black, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap behind her. Faint and pale is the form of her dead husband. Abraham Lincoln looms like a shadow, not ominous, but ethereal. His face is soft, his hands hover just above her shoulders. The impression is gentle, protective, transparent, but unmistakable. The image, taken sometime in the early 1870s, shows Mary alone in a studio. And yet, there he is, Abraham Lincoln, a ghost, captured on glass. The photograph was made by William H. a former engraver from Boston, who in the years after the Civil War found his calling in a new and unlikely profession, spirit photography. In an era shaken by death on a national scale, Mumbler's portraits offered something that ordinary photographs could not likeness, but presence. He claimed that with the right technique and perhaps the right spiritual alignment, his camera could see what the human eye could not. The dead, he said, could appear alongside the living. Spirit photography began with a mistake. Mumbler had been experimenting with a new camera in the 1860s, when upon developing a self-portrait, he noticed another figure faintly present in the image, a seated girl, semi-transparent, hovering behind him. He believed it resembled a cousin who had died 12 years earlier or so. He said others claimed it was merely a reused glass plate, accidentally double exposed. But the idea had taken root, and Mumbler saw what it might become. The camera at the time was still something close to magic. Photographic plates were coated in chemicals exposed to light and developed through a careful process that left room for both artistry and accident. Long exposures could record more than just stillness. They could absorb movement, suggestion. Ghostly effects were not difficult to create with planning. A figure introduced late into the exposure, a double exposure with two separate images on a single plate. These were not sleight of hand tricks. They were technical manipulations made easier by the slow and temperamental nature of early photographic equipment. But for those in grief, for those yearning to see someone once more, explanation was beside the point. The results mattered. The presence mattered. After the Civil War, grief hung over the country like mist. Hundreds of thousands had died. Widows, parents, children, whole communities felt the absence of men who had marched away and never returned. The war had carved holes cue into families, and into that silence came spiritualism. Seances became common, hosted in parlor by mediums who claimed to channel the dead. The movement had started before the war, but its growth in the 1860s was fed by a nation in mourning. It was not fringe respected. Citizens participated, newspapers printed seance accounts. Even the White House was not untouched. Mary Todd Lincoln had long been drawn to spiritualism after the death of her son Willie in 1862. She sought out mediums and table rappers in Washington. She held seances in the executive mansion, attended sometimes by President Lincoln himself. Though more curious than convinced for Mary, it was not a hobby. It was a desperate search for contact after her husband's assassination. In 1865, Mary's grief deepened into a quiet isolation. She dressed in mourning for the rest of her life. She moved through cities, from hotels to relatives' homes, never truly settled. And at some point in the early 1870s, accounts differ on the exact year, she sat for a photograph in the studio of William Mumbler. She gave a false name, Mrs. Lindell, perhaps to avoid attention, perhaps because even then she wasn't sure what to expect. The studio was likely quiet, dark drapes, the smell of chemicals, the slow hum of preparation. Amla, accustomed to grieving clients, would have guided her gently. She would have been seated, arranged in light, told to stay still. The exposure would take time, and then the wait. As the plate developed, as the image emerged, there would be the moment Mumbler revealed what the camera had seen there. He was the photograph shows a faint Abraham Lincoln draped in white, standing behind Mary with hands poised over her. He does not touch her, he does not look directly to the camera, but he is there to those who believed it was a sign of comfort that the president, even in death, remained close to his wife, that love, or duty, or divine grace had allowed him to appear. The photo circulated quietly at first. Then more widely it became one of the most famous examples of spirit's photography, not just for its subject but for what it seemed to represent, a connection across death's divide. Mumla had photographed others, hundreds of them, widows, parents, siblings, in his images. The living sat composed while ghostly figures hovered behind or beside them, sometimes clear, sometimes faint. Some figures were easily recognizable, others were not. Occasionally, the spirits looked suspiciously like earlier portraits Mumbler had made, or had access to. Critics noticed accusations. Followed in 1869, Mumbler was brought to trial in New York City on charges of fraud. The case became a sensation. Prominent photographers testified. One showed how the same ghostly figure had appeared in multiple unrelated photographs. Another demonstrated how double exposures could create identical effects. Even P.T. Barnum weighed in, calling Mumbler a charlatan who preyed on the grieving, yet the prosecution could not prove the mechanism of deception. No damning evidence emerged, no duplicate negatives, no eyewitnesses. 2. Trickery. The case was dismissed. Mumbler's career never fully recovered, but the myth had been established. T's hitographs, whether believed or not, endured. The image of Mary Todd Lincoln with her spectral husband behind her became iconic. It was reproduced, debated, admired. Some dismissed it outright. Others clung to it. For Mary, who kept the photo, it may have offered a sense of closeness that nothing else could. She never spoke publicly about the sitting, but she had chosen to go, and she had kept the result. To understand why people believed, it is necessary to understand what photography was. At the time, it was new. It was technical, yes, but it was also mysterious. The idea that a camera could catch more than the eye could see did not seem impossible. The lines between science and spirit were not yet firm, and in a culture saturated with mourning, a picture was more than a picture. It was memory, it was evidence, it was, perhaps, a window. Even knowing the likelihood of manipulation, even suspecting the technique, some still found meaning because the ghost was someone they loved, and the photograph said, "They are still with you." The ghost image of Abraham Lincoln is almost certainly a fabrication, but for those who looked at it then, and even now it remains something more than a fraud. It is a portrait of longing, of belief, shaped by loss, a reminder that grief finds form wherever it can, and that sometimes even the faintest silhouette can offer comfort.